It paints a suffocating yet fascinating picture of modern isolation. Just imagine this room for a second. It isn't just messy, it's a fortress constructed from refuse. There is a literal animal trail carved through piles of discarded clothes and tattered manga, leading to a door barricaded from the inside with cardboard boxes and a folded chair. The occupant, Miyu, has turned his bedroom into a siege bunker to keep the world out. But watch what happens when the enemy approaches. It's not a monster, it's just his brother, Satoru, the successful sibling in the casual summer suit. Yet the sound of those footsteps triggers a panic in Miyu so violent that his vision fades. And here is where the behavior takes a jarring, contradictory turn. To escape the noise of a simple conversation, Miyu seeks peace in the most violent way possible. He grabs a utility knife. What's truly haunting is his reaction to the weapon. He doesn't hold it with fear, he holds it with blissful serenity. The click, click, click of the extending blade calms him down more than any human voice could. He rationalizes that the pain is a welcome reminder that he is still here. It's a twisted logic. He is terrified of living, yet finds comfort in the tool that could end his life. But then, the scene snaps. Just as the blade presses against a friendship bracelet on his wrist, a hallucination or perhaps a memory of a childhood voice stops him cold. It forces us to ask, when a person has barricaded themselves against the entire physical world, how can a ghost from the past be the only thing strong enough to break in? That terrifying intimacy, that profound level of withdrawal, that's the subject of our deep dive today.
It is. We're looking at the phenomenon known as Hikikomori.
And there's a clinical definition for this, right? From the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare in Japan.
There is. They define it as prolonged social withdrawal. So that means avoiding school, avoiding work, really any kind of socializing outside the home.
For how long?
For more than half a year. But as that opening scene with Miyu makes so clear the clinical definition, it really just scratches the surface.
Yeah, it doesn't capture the emotional reality of it at all. So for this deep dive, our goal is to really unpack this. We want to look at the huge socioeconomic pressures that kind of birth this phenomenon.
Right. And then see how digital life has become both an escape and, in some ways, a trap.
And finally, you want to analyze the specific, almost measurable dynamics within families that can actually start the recovery process.
And we should start by saying, well, Hikikomori first really came to light as a concept in Japan.
It's not just a Japanese thing anymore.
Not at all. It's gone global. We're seeing similar, often really severe cases of prolonged social withdrawal everywhere. Australia, France.
The US, Korea, India, it's popping up in post-industrial nations all over.
It is. And that immediately changes how you have to look at it. We're not talking about a culture-bound syndrome.
So it's not something unique to Japanese culture.
No. The thinking now is that it's a society-bound syndrome. The underlying factors are these universal stressors of modern life.
And even just within Japan, the scale of this it's pretty big, isn't it?
It's significant. The lifetime prevalence among people aged 20 to 49 is estimated at about 1.2%.
1.2%. That might not sound like a lot, but when you do the math.
It's hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of lives just completely removed from public view, from public interaction. And that creates this, this really complex and honestly accelerating public health crisis that we really need to investigate.
Okay, so if we want to understand how someone gets to the point of building a fortress in their bedroom, we have to start with the foundation.
The economics.
Exactly, the economic pressure. When did society start, pushing people into these rooms?
The timeline is pretty clear. It all starts in the early 1990s in Japan.
Right after the boom years.
Precisely. The single defining event was the catastrophic burst of the Japanese bubble economy in 1991.
And what followed was, it's literally called the lost decade, right?
Lost decade, which for a lot of people really stretched into the lost 20 years. It was this period of long-term economic stagnation that just fundamentally broke the rigid post-war Japanese employment system.
And there was a very specific choice made during that time, wasn't there? A choice about who to protect.
A critical choice. Japanese corporations and, the government, they made a decision. They chose to protect the established older workforce at the direct expense of the new generation.
How did they do that?
Well, the traditional model in Japan was built on this idea of implied lifetime employment.
Loyalty and seniority.
Exactly. So when the economy flatlined, companies had to slash costs. But they did it by preserving the jobs of their older established salarymen.
So the burden fell on...
Who?
It fell almost entirely on new graduates. Companies just severely, drastically limited their intake of new hires. They effectively just shut the door on young people trying to enter the stable mainstream workforce.
And that period from about 1994 to 2004, that's what's known as the employment ice age.
The Shushoku Hijaki.
Yeah.
The employment ice age.
So the generation that came of age during that time, the people who are now in their 40s and 50s, they weren't just facing a bad job market. They were essentially put on a completely different life track.
That's the perfect way to put it. They became the lost generation.
Because if you missed that one window, the window was gone forever. If you didn't get a job with a major corporation right out of university, that was probably it. You were condemned to a life of, unstable, temporary, contract-based work.
Or no work at all.
Or cycling between low-paying part-time jobs and unemployment.
Yeah.
The long-term consequences were just devastating.
I mean, you can imagine your finances are precarious.
You have limited access to Social Security. You've got chronic health issues from the stress and instability.
And no ability to start a family or buy a house or do any of the things that, mark a transition into adulthood.
They never achieved those expected markers of Japanese adulthood because the opportunity was just. It was systematically denied to them.
Can we put some numbers on that just to really paint a picture of how bleak it was? Because, every generation feels like they have a tough job market.
This was something else entirely. It was far beyond a standard fluctuation. Let's look at the ratio of new job openings to job seekers.
Okay.
Before the crash, in 91, that ratio was a really healthy 1.43.
Meaning more jobs than people looking for them.
Right. Plenty of opportunity. After the stagnation hit, that ratio just plummeted. It hit its lowest point, its nadir, around 2009 at 0.45.
0.45. So less than one job for every two people looking?
For every one stable job opening, you had more than 2 qualified graduates fighting for it. And this went on year after year for over a decade. The system was just structurally incapable of absorbing them.
That context, it changes everything about how you see social withdrawal.
It has to.
When the system is that broken, locking yourself away, it stops looking like a personal failure and it starts to look like a rational, if tragic, response.
That is the crucial synthesis. The macroeconomic failure of the Ice Age directly fueled this rise in social problems. It wasn't just Hikikomori. You also saw a big spike in suicide rates.
Because of the frustration.
The absolute frustration of being capable, being educated, and just finding no place for yourself, no path to upward mobility. For many, the conclusion was that society itself was toxic, that it was rejecting them.
So why participate?
Why participate in a game that's rigged against you from the start? Withdrawal becomes the ultimate act of non-participation.
Which brings us to the terrifying long-term consequence of that, this idea of the 80-50 problem.
Yeah. It sounds like a math problem, but it's a social time bomb.
And the term describes what exactly?
It describes this crisis where you have middle-aged, reclusive, unemployed people often in their 50s.
So the tail end of that lost generation.
Right, and they're still completely financially dependent on their parents.
Who are now in their 80s.
They're increasingly frail, elderly parents. It shows you that Hikikomori is not a youth problem anymore. It's an intergenerational crisis caused by decades of economic exclusion.
We have to talk about the scale of this. How many people are we talking about who are caught in this 80-50 trap?
It's massive. A major government survey in 2019, it estimated that Japan has about 613,000 middle-aged Hikikomori.
613,000.
Yeah. Individuals aged 40 to 65.
That's a population larger than many major cities. People who have been isolated for, 20, 30 years?
In many cases, yes. And their initial social exclusion is now becoming this overwhelming geriatric and social welfare challenge. The system just wasn't designed for this. It wasn't built to support hundreds of thousands of people whose isolation started when they were 20.
And the human stories behind that number are they're devastating. The case of Hiroshi, for instance, it shows you exactly what happens when that economic umbilical cord gets cut.
It's a profoundly illustrative case. Hiroshi was 54. He had been withdrawn since the bubble burst, so for 3 decades.
Living entirely dependent on his mother.
His sole source of financial and logistical support. And then she passed away.
And suddenly, 30 years of private isolation becomes a public emergency.
Immediately. When a welfare officer finally managed to make contact with him, Hiroshi's first reaction wasn't about his mother. It wasn't grief. It wasn't panic about his future.
What was it?
His only source of anxiety was whether the electricity would be cut off.
Because the bank account was frozen.
Precisely. He wasn't connecting to the human loss. He was connecting to the logistical collapse of the system that allowed his isolation to exist.
His whole reality was tied to that bank account.
His life had been outsourced to his elderly mother.
Yeah.
She facilitated his withdrawal. And his tragedy just starkly illustrates the immense long-term cost of society failing to reintegrate these people decades earlier.
This isn't just about one person's tragedy.
No, it's a catastrophic failure of the public support structure. It shows what happens when there's no intervention, no meaningful alternative provided before the parent dies. The private tragedy becomes a massive public debt and a huge welfare obligation.
It's almost irrational, though. You just said the system isn't designed for this, and yet Japan now is facing these severe labor shortages.
A huge labor shortage.
So you have a desperate need for workers on one hand, and this massive group of middle-aged, potentially capable people on the other. Why isn't the job market just pulling them back in?
It seems like it should, but it's rooted in this really deeply ingrained corporate culture.
Which is?
Well, Japanese employers have this rigid, decades-long preference for hiring fresh graduates.
Right, people they can mold from scratch.
Exactly. They want to train them, instill corporate loyalty. And this traditional structure views anyone outside that narrow path, especially older workers who've been unemployed for a decade or more, as fundamentally difficult to integrate.
So they're seen as damaged goods, in a way.
Lacking current skills or just too non-traditional, it creates this enormous, almost insurmountable barrier for them to re-enter the stable job market.
So even with the demographics screaming for a change, I think the working age population is projected to shrink by 20% by 2040.
Yeah, and they're forecasting a shortage of over 11 million workers by then.
Even with that, the market is rejecting the available supply because it doesn't fit the old mold.
That's the deadlock. The need is acute. And, the government has recognized this. They've launched some initiatives.
Like what?
Appealing to employers to hire 3 million workers from the Ice Age generation, pledging billions for training programs. But these efforts are facing just deep structural resistance. They're widely seen as being far too little and far too late.
The crisis started 30 years ago.
Exactly. And the societal cost is just accelerating now. You feel it through stagnant wages, shrinking public services, and the escalating welfare burden of the 80-50 problem.
Okay, so we've established this massive historical trigger, the economic collapse. Now we need to shift our focus from the macro to the micro.
To the individual psychology and the family unit.
Right, because we have to get beyond this, frankly, really simplistic idea that Hikikomori is just about being lazy.
That's vital. The sources are absolutely clear on this. Many, many cases involve genuine physical and psychosocial difficulties. When people finally do get to a mental health welfare center for support, the data shows that up to 80.3% have a diagnosed psychiatric disorder.
80%. So this is not a lifestyle choice.
It is often a devastating comorbidity.
What are the primary issues that are showing up? What kind of disorders?
It's a range. You see mood disorders, severe anxiety disorders, personality disorders, and also developmental disorders like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD.
And these individuals, they consistently report a lower quality of life.
Significantly lower.
Yeah.
And the long-term withdrawal itself can create secondary problems.
Physical problems.
Yeah, severe nutritional disorders from, a very limited, unhealthy diet. Even voice disturbances, sometimes from not having spoken aloud to another human in years. The psychosocial and the physical are they're inextricably linked.
Now, historically, there was a big focus on a specific cultural concept to explain this, amayu.
Right, amayu.
Could you just sort of unpack what that is and why that theory, while it was important, has kind of been challenged?
Sure. Amayu is a core Japanese psychological concept, really brought to the West by the psychiatrist Takeo Doi. It describes an emotional relationship, usually between a parent and child, where one person expects and seeks the nurturing of another.
Like a child expecting unconditional love from a mother.
That's a good way to think of it. And the old hypothesis was that overprotective or overly indulgent parenting, that's the ME, fostered such a high degree of dependency.
That when the kid faced the real world,
the pressure of job hunting or school failure, they just retreated back into the unconditional safety of the family. The family allowed the withdrawal to continue.
It sounds plausible on the surface, so why has the empirical evidence struggled to back that up as the main cause?
Because when researchers actually started gathering retrospective data on family environments, they found that other factors were far more predictive of someone experiencing hikikomori.
And the Umeda study is a key piece of research here, right?
It is. It's really revealing because it looked at childhood family environments in the general population, and it controlled for the person's own history of mental disorders. It was trying to isolate the sociological triggers.
And what did it find? The results were pretty surprising, suggesting a link between family resources and isolation.
They were very counterintuitive. The study found 3 statistically significant positive associations with social withdrawal. The strongest was a father's high educational level.
A father's high education. What was the odds ratio on that?
It was striking, an odds ratio of 6.0.
Okay, let's pause on that. An odds ratio of 6.0, what does that actually mean for someone listening?
It's a measure of association. So an OR of 1.0 means the factor has no impact. An OR of 6.0 means that statistically, a person from a family where the father has a high education level is 6 times more likely to experience hikikomori in their lifetime.
6 times more likely, even when you account for their own mental health issues.
Exactly.
That is staggering. It completely flips the script on this being a problem of, neglect or lower class families. It's just the opposite.
That high-resource, highly educated families are significantly more vulnerable.
So what's the thinking there? Why would that be the case?
Well, the analysis points to 2 main effects. The first is pretty practical. High education usually correlates with higher income, more family wealth. And that wealth provides the financial cushion, the stability that allows prolonged withdrawal to even happen. An adult child can't stay locked in a room for 20 years if the family can't pay the rent and buy the food.
So the wealth basically builds the infrastructure for the fortress.
It enables the isolation.
And what about the psychological side of that high education level?
That's the second and maybe more potent factor.
Yeah.
Incredibly high parental expectations.
Ah.
In Japan's intensely competitive education and career system, a highly educated parent can, inadvertently transfer this enormous, relentless pressure onto their child to succeed.
So when the child stumbles, fails an exam, gets rejected for a job during the Ice Age,
the sense of shame and failure is magnified. It's proportional to how high those original expectations were. So withdrawal becomes the ultimate escape from that crushing pressure. The fortress keeps the world out, but more importantly, it keeps the weight of expected success out.
And the other 2 factors the study found were related to the mother's mental health.
That's right. Mother's common mental disorders and, specifically, mother's panic disorders both had very high odds ratios as well.
So you combine that high-pressure, high-expectation environment with maternal anxiety.
And you have an extremely fertile ground for isolation. A child who's already struggling with external pressures finds less emotional safety at home, and that just reinforces the avoidance. The data really supports this conclusion that hikikomori is more likely in these educated families. It's a syndrome of modern pressure, not underprivilege.
Which brings us to the huge challenge of recovery. You said earlier only about 7% of individuals seek help on their own.
That's right. It's almost always the family that reaches out first.
So how do they even begin to break through a communication deadlock that's probably lasted for years or even decades?
The difficulty is just tremendous. I mean, they've often tried everything, pleading, threatening, ignoring it. And the path to recovery has to start with the fundamental shift in the family dynamic itself.
And the anecdote of Mr. Sato is a perfect illustration of this.
It is. Mr. Sato, the retired corporate warrior.
Right. His entire life was built on duty and achievement, and he just projected that onto his son.
For 6 years, his son had been withdrawn. And Mr. Sato's default response was to bang on the locked door and scream about duty and shame.
Which is a non-adaptive behavior.
Completely. It only solidifies the barrier. The son just hears that as external confirmation of his own failure.
So how did he break through? What was the shift?
He was coached to change his entire approach. He had to move from authoritarian demand to vulnerable confession.
So instead of demanding his son come out and conform,
he started a ritual. Every evening at 7 p.m., he would go sit outside his son's locked door, and he would read aloud from the old childhood picture books his son loved when he was 5.
From the time before the isolation began.
He was intentionally regressing the interaction to a safer, more innocent time. It was this conscious act of humility.
He wasn't even talking to his son, in a way.
No, he was talking about his own life, his own regrets, his fears, using the books as a sort of safe vehicle for that vulnerability. He was stripping away the armor of the father figure.
And the result?
After 5 years of silence, the first communication was a crude drawing of a character from one of those books, slid under the door.
Wow.
That small sketch was the first flicker of connection. And it just shows that the family has to be willing to meet the person where they are, no matter how distant that emotional landscape is.
It goes back to that opening scene with Miyu. The memory of a childhood voice can be the only thing strong enough to break through.
As we get into the 21st century, the whole phenomenon has evolved alongside technology. The internet and digital spaces are now. They're central to modern withdrawal.
For a lot of these individuals, the room is the physical boundary, but the digital space is the world they actually live in.
Absolutely. And the correlation isn't subtle at all. The sources show a very strong link between the Hikikomori trait and both internet and smartphone addiction.
The amount of time they spend online is just staggering.
We're talking about people who frequently report screen times of more than 12 hours a day.
And this often involves other issues, right? Like internet gaming disorder?
Yes, IGB is a very common co-occurring condition. The time they spend playing games is so intense that it actually moderates the association between their withdrawal and their addiction.
Meaning what? The gaming and the withdrawal become the same thing?
In essence, yeah. The virtual world stops being just an activity. It becomes the replacement for physical reality.
So what is it about that virtual world that's so compelling? What's the core attraction for someone who's completely retreated from the physical one?
The core attraction is really the promise of anonymity and autonomy.
Okay.
Think about it. The physical world, especially in a place like Japan, it demanded rigid conformity, high performance, constant social accountability.
All the pressures that probably contributed to their withdrawal in the first place.
Yeah.
Bullying, failure.
Right. The internet completely flips that script. It allows you to construct a preferred self, an idealized identity. You can have social interactions without the risk of face-to-face judgment or shame.
It's a psychologically safer space.
Much safer.
And this digital safety net, it allows for these really close but also incredibly fragile relationships to form.
Yeah.
This digital intimacy.
Yeah, and the story of Kaito Miyu is just a vivid illustration of how blurry that line between the real and virtual can get.
So Kaito was a college dropout, isolated in Tokyo.
Physically isolated, yeah. Living in a cramped apartment, subsisting on convenience store food. In the real world, he was basically invisible.
But online, in VR chat.
He became Kai, a version of himself that was confident, witty, empathetic, and he formed this 2-year-long intimacy with another avatar named Miyu.
And their relationship was built on what?
On deep, late-night conversations. They would just share their deepest traumas and fears while their pixelated avatars sat next to each other on a virtual riverbank in Kyoto.
So the emotional connection was real, even if the setting and the bodies were just simulations.
It was profoundly real.
Yeah.
But they knew nothing about each other's actual lives.
Mm-hmm.
No real names, no faces. And this worked perfectly. Until Miyu just vanished from the digital world.
And Kaito was just thrown into a crisis.
An existential crisis.
Yeah.
The silence in his real apartment, which had been fine before because he had this digital connection, it suddenly became deafening. The panic was the equivalent of losing a spouse.
So he drove to the ocean.
He did. He drove to the ocean just to feel something real. And standing there, feeling the cold salt spray, he had this realization.
Which was?
That the crashing waves felt less substantial, less real than Miyu's pixelated embrace.
Wow. That is the ultimate paradox of this. For someone who is so withdrawn, the simulation becomes the primary, authentic source of warmth and connection.
It really redefines what a real relationship is. And the challenge for families and therapists is recognizing that this digital connection, however strange it seems, is their social life. Dismissing it can sever their very last link to another person.
So if the internet is both the perfect enabler of isolation and also the source of their only intimacy, can that same technology be used as a path back?
That's the paradoxical question researchers are looking at right now. Can you use the motivational power of digital media for therapeutic recovery? And that's led to concepts like exergaming.
Exergaming. So exercising through games. What's an example of that?
The most famous and probably most successful example is Pokemon Go.
Of course.
Because the game fundamentally requires you to physically travel to real-world locations, a park, a monument, a specific street corner, all to catch these virtual creatures.
And research found this was actually effective in getting Hikikomori individuals to leave their rooms.
Highly effective. It encouraged them to get outside and engage in some low-stakes physical activity.
The genius of it is that the motivation is internal. You want to complete the game, but the mechanism forces engagement with the external world.
Precisely. It leverages the appeal of gamification, which they are already highly susceptible to, and uses it as a catalyst for physical mobility. The key for any intervention like this is striking a really delicate balance.
A balance between using the tech and not letting it become another addiction.
Exactly. You have to use the motivational power to promote reality while being acutely aware of the high risk of device addiction. The digital part has to be a means to a real-world end, not an end in itself.
Let's circle back to the family structure, because this is where the conversation about recovery gets really critical. We said earlier that family factors aren't strongly linked to the start of Hikikomori,
Right.
but they are critically associated with the improvement process.
And that is the essential paradigm shift for anyone trying to help. We stop blaming the family for the problem, and we start empowering them to be part of the solution.
So how do researchers measure that progress?
They use tools like the Adaptive Behavior Scale for Hikikomori, or ABSH. It tracks progress across 4 key areas:
Which are?
interaction with family and others, the pursuit of goals, maintaining internal values like self-worth, and crucially, external social participation. So, school or work.
And when you compare the scores of the Hikikomori group to a control group, what does that tell you about where to even begin with recovery?
Well, the adaptive behaviors are lower across the board for the withdrawn group, obviously. But the size of the deficits reveals a really important pattern.
Okay.
The deficit in external social participation work, or school, showed the biggest difference compared to the control group.
Which makes sense. That's the core of the issue.
Right. It underscores how profoundly cut off they are from public life. But on the other side, the deficit in family interaction showed the smallest difference.
That's a powerful distinction.
Yeah.
So it's saying that even the most severe cases, there's often still some baseline possibility for communication within the family.
Exactly. Even if it's minimal, that baseline is the only leverage point you have for an intervention. Since their whole world is the home, they're incredibly susceptible to the influence of those family interaction patterns.
So the goal isn't to immediately force them back out into the world?
No, that's the area of their largest deficit. The goal is to first repair and optimize the communication channels within the family. You have to make the fortress safe from the inside.
This is where we get into 2 very specific factors that research shows can influence improvement: the family behavioral repertoire and functional family interaction.
Right. Let's start with the repertoire.
Okay, what is the family behavioral repertoire?
The Family Behavioral Repertoire, or FBSH, refers to the skills the parents have to acquire. It's the extent to which they've learned functional ways of coping and interacting.
So specific behavior.
Observable behaviors, yeah. Being cooperative, being assertive without being aggressive, showing self-control, maintaining a cheerful demeanor. These are the tools they need to gently dismantle the fortress walls.
So, going back to Mr. Sato, him shouting duty and shame was non-adaptive. What would an adaptive repertoire look like in that situation?
An adaptive repertoire would be replacing that confrontation with a gentle, non-demanding invitation, using a kind, non-judgmental tone of voice, even if you don't get a response.
Right.
It means starting a conversation about something the child is interested in, a video game, a manga, instead of demanding they talk about job hunting. It's about demonstrating those cooperative, self-controlled behaviors even when you're frustrated.
So the repertoire is the what? It's the skills.
Yeah.
And the second factor, family interaction, or FISH, that's the how the skills are applied.
Precisely. FISH measures the overall functionality and the predictability of the parent-child communication. And the key metric here is something called cognition of contingency.
Okay, that's a dense one. Let's unpack cognition of contingency.
It's essentially the family's ability to recognize and accurately predict the results of their own actions.
So cause and effect.
Exactly. A family with high contingency awareness understands that yelling will reliably lead to more withdrawal. And a gentle, persistent act of vulnerability, like reading a picture book, will reliably lead to a small sign of engagement, like a drawing under the door.
It's being aware of the predictable consequences of your own behavior.
That's it. It's not enough to just have the skills in your toolbox. You have to know which skill to use, when to use it, and what the likely outcome is going to be for your specific child.
So Mr. Sato, for years, he had this big repertoire of authoritarian commands from his corporate life, but his contingency awareness was 0. He couldn't predict that shouting would just make things worse.
And it was only when he changed his behavior reading the book and saw the result, the drawing, that his cognition of contingency improved. He learned a new equation. Vulnerability leads to connection. Demanding leads to silence.
We did the research find about the relationship between these 2 factors. Do you need both?
You do. The research showed that acquiring a sufficient family behavioral repertoire is the foundation. It's significantly associated with improvement in interacting with family and with the individual's internal values. But functional family interaction, meaning high cognition of contingency, enhances and strengthens that association. That's the crucial finding. Skills alone are not enough. The quality and the predictability of the communication have to be functional too.
Which implies that the family has to be incredibly conscious and deliberate in everything they do.
That's the ultimate takeaway. The researchers noted that in a control group, a non-Hikikomori family, a parent with a great behavioral repertoire could often compensate, even if their contingency awareness was a bit low.
They could get away with it.
But for the Hikikomori group, that wasn't the case. They could not supplement insufficient cognition of contingency with their behavioral repertoire alone. The normal margin of error in communication is it's gone. Every interaction has to be intentional and calibrated.
That must be an incredibly slow and painful process for the parents.
It's incredibly demanding. But the data confirms that this slow, meticulous progress, like that single drawing from Mr. Sato's son, is the key to the whole process. That continuous, intentional effort to repair the internal communication helps the individual rebuild their self-worth in the safest possible environment.
But we do need to be clear about the limitations of this family-focused approach. What did the research say about external participation, like getting a job?
This is the really important nuance for managing expectations. While these family interventions significantly helped with adaptive behaviors inside the home social interaction, the person's internal values, they did not show a strong association with external social participation.
So fixing the family dynamic doesn't automatically get the person back to school or work.
The family's efforts can successfully transform the fortress into a home, but they don't immediately open the front door to the outside world.
It suggests the journey is not a sudden return.
No, it's a slow, internal, relational process. The first therapeutic goal is just stabilization, trust, and rebuilding self-worth through functional family dynamics. Only once that foundation is solid can the individual even begin to think about approaching the external world, the area of greatest pressure, on their own terms.
The internal work has to come first.
It absolutely has to be completed first before external participation is even a viable option.
So we've really traveled from the devastation of that macroeconomic shock that created the lost generation. We've explored the microscopic psychological pressures inside an educated, anxious family, and we've analyzed the specific, measurable communication required for healing.
And what we're seeing is a phenomenon that is fundamentally evolving. The research overwhelmingly supports this idea that hikikomori is shifting away from being seen as some kind of unique, culture-bound syndrome.
To what?
To complex, society-bound syndrome. It's inextricably linked to the immense pressures of post-industrial life, to severe economic upheaval that locks millions out of stability, and to the immediate, easy availability of an anonymous digital escape.
So understanding that interconnectedness is key.
It is. The psychological reality, the family dynamic, the socioeconomic causes, they are all deeply intertwined. And that underscores this profound need for comprehensive, culturally aware public health support systems that don't just target the symptoms of isolation, but that target the systemic failures and the communication deadlocks that trap individuals in the first place.